Okay, continuing with research methods part 2 for February 5th. Okay, so we were just talking about monotonic relationships and concomitant relationships. So I'm going to look at spuriousness. So spuriousness is something that will happen with the data as you're analyzing the data, that a finding might be just way out in left field and not going along with the rest of the data. So you might think of this as someone in a class, the whole class gets, B's and C's, but then there's always that one person who has to get the A, and not just an A, like 110, so that the professor won't curb the grade. So that's a spurious finding, one that happens, and it's just way out there. We also call that an outlier, okay? And an outlier is something that's laying outside of the rest of the data. So you may be running your study, and you may find that, there's someone in your study that has data that's way out there. And that's the outlier. We have to deal with the outlier because what happens is that outlier will change the average, and then you will have a data sample that's skewed and not presenting a correct picture of what's going on. Let's say someone takes a test and they get 110, and everyone else got, C, C plus, B minus, okay? If you add that outlier in, it's going to raise the average of the class to, like, a high B or maybe an A minus, which if you have several outliers, like you have a little group of people that scored super high, then it doesn't tell you an accurate description that, hey, the majority of them did not do really well. Just because, the average is this, it's being thrown over to the high grades, and it's not really the case, okay? So that's the danger of outliers. If you have that in your study, we will deal with it when it happens, so that we get a true depiction of what's actually going on in your research, okay? Now, there's also something called internal and external validity that we look for when we do research to make a balance of the study, okay? So a field study where you go out and you collect data in the real world. How do people behave in the real world? That is a really good way to look at the information, because people can answer a questionnaire and they'll say, well, I would do this or I would do that. And they may just be trying to look good, or they may have other reasons for answering the question. But when it comes into the real world, they don't behave like that at all. So when you go and you do research in the real world, that's called a field study. And you're out there doing that, and you get good data. Now, there's not all pro with the field research. Sometimes, people know they're being watched, or they're acting atypically in a field research as well. So there has its drawbacks as well. More difficult to collect data in some cases. And in a internal study, or study that, you're doing a questionnaire, people are answering the questionnaire, or they're, telling you what they would do or giving your opinion and stuff like that, doesn't mean that they're going to actually do that when given the opportunity. So it doesn't actually mean that that's, a true measure of behavior, okay? Because people try to always, present themselves in a good light. So external validity would be the field study. They're out there in the public, and you're looking at people or animals or what have you in the natural setting, okay? It's high in what we call external validity. It's very realistic, okay? You're looking at things and finding out information, and it's very realistic study, so you expect that behavior is indicative of the way it should be, or the way they actually would act. So we would say that a study like that is high in external validity. Internal validity is the amount of control that you have over research. So when you are, let's take jury research as an example. If you're in a moot courtroom at a law school, and this is something that looks just like a courtroom, except, that you're trying a case, and the case is trying to be presented as accurately as possible. So someone's playing the role of judge, someone's playing the role of prosecutor, someone's playing the role of defense. You have a defendant, you have prosecuting witnesses, things like that. You have a plaintiff. The people in the study, the mock jurors, know that it's not a real case. okay? Even though you may be using the exact transcript of the case, they still know, hey, I'm in a moot courtroom in a law school, okay? So you have that. But you do have control over everything that's happening in the moot courtroom because, you know, you have paying the actors, they have the transcript, there's no surprises, there's no, you know, the way people are acting the way they would in a real trial, okay? The judge might give a funny look or, you know, all kinds of things that would happen. And so that would be high in internal validity. Now, if you were running a study and you were actually at the court and you're going to see how actual jurors behave, that would be high in external validity, okay? So you're always trying to balance internal and external validity so that you have a good deal of control over the outcome of your study, that you don't have any extraneous thing happen that would throw your results into question, and that you could get good results. So, and then external validity studies are trying to get control because they're out in the real world and anything could happen that would throw their results, okay? So internal validity, control in an artificial setting, that's their advantage, and it lacks realism. And external validity is it's high in realism, but the control is lessened. So you have to try and find a balance. And later on, we're going to talk about how that balance looks. In the test, you're going to have to identify whether the study is high, medium, or low in validity and what kind of validity it is, internal, external, or a combination of both, okay? Okay, so another thing that could happen in your study is a cohort effect, okay? And a cohort is a group, okay? So the most popular type of thing when we talk of cohorts is an age group, okay? Let's say you want to know about, you know, attitudes for politics, okay? And you're going to look at different age groups. Those age groups would constitute a cohort, okay? So you're going to compare millennials and Gen Z and Gen X and baby boomers and World War II people, the few that are remaining, unfortunately. And you're going to look at the way they feel about any particular attitude. The cohort, or the birth year, birth years of that cohort are generational. And so maybe the cohort is just something's going on with that cohort, and they score differently than people in the other cohorts. So you might have a statistically significant finding that is a cohort finding. Maybe, you know, like here's my study, and some of these people are, you know, scoring in a particular way. Why is that? Well, maybe something happened in 1949, and all the people who were born in 1949 have a really different reaction to something. And so then your next study will be, why is it that these people react this way? What's going on with that cohort? So you may remember when you were in grammar school that there was a distinct personality for all of your classes. You know, the 8th graders were like this, and the 7th graders were like this, and the 6th graders were like this. And as they progressed, they became the 9th graders, the 8th graders, the 7th graders. But it was still that cohort that was a certain way. And I know when I was going to school, we had a cohort of people who we considered troublemakers. And no matter what grade they were in, that cohort, that class, they were the troublemaking class. So that would be looking at data like in a cohort, okay? So you might have a cohort effect to deal with in your research. I just want you to be able to know what that is. You might see it, you know, in a study that you pick up, and you might say, wow, these people are reacting differently. That's because of a cohort. So when you think of some of the things that we call different generations of people, like the World War II people have been called the greatest generations. That's because they fought in World War II and they brought, you know, sanity to an insane situation with Hirohito and Hitler. And so they were heroic. And were they actually more heroic than the generations that followed them? You know, there's a question, okay? But you have these little rules of thumb like, oh, that's the greatest generation. And, you know, the baby boomers, they were the hippie generation. So, you know, every generation has their little nickname, but you don't know that that's an actual effect until you actually do the research. And you don't know that one of those generations is more or less of something than the other until you actually do the research, okay? Nicknames notwithstanding. Another thing that you might find is history effects, okay? You might look at two different things that are happening in your research, and then you find out that the effect is gone. Like it was only true for a little while, and now it's not true anymore. That's called a history effect. We don't know why something stops being significant, but there are definitely times when something stops being significant, and then you have to go back in the next piece of research and say, well, why? So going back to my study that I talked to you about, my student who did fear of crime as an undergraduate and his freshman year, and then he went back in graduate school and did the same exact fear of crime study at Tiffin University. Now, so I can't remember the exact findings of his studies, but had he found out that there was less fear of crime when he was a grad student than there was as an undergraduate, and it was statistically different between the two different time periods that he was looking at, the next study would be like, well, why? What changed at Tiffin University from time 1 to time 2? And it could be a myriad of things. Research is endless, right? It could be, well, now we have a campus security that we didn't have before. Now we have this in place, or now this law has been here and been enacted and made campus that much safer. Maybe the students changed. Maybe, faculty attitudes toward crime on campus changed, or a lot of different things could have caused the change. So your next piece of research would be to find out which was the most important contribution to lessen the fear of crime on campus. So that's how that goes with a history effect. So there you go. Maturation. You may find that a study matures out. So we find this true with addiction. And one of the famous maturation things that we find is that as people get older, they don't do as hard drugs, okay? And that's part of a maturation effect. Wow, look at that. We have this number of heroin addicts when people are teenagers, this number when they're 20s, this number when they're 30s, and then it drops down when they're 40s. Why is there that maturation effect? Well, one of the reasons is because we don't have many 40, 50, or 60-year-old heroin addicts because they tend to die overdose, and that's what happens. Or you can look at the same thing with, we have our offenders, our teenagers. We have so many teenage offenders. We have so many offenders in the 20s. We have so many offenders in the 30s. And then they reach 40, 50, 60, and the rate of offending, or the number of offenders, goes down drastically. Why is that? Well, crime is a young person's sport. Old people generally are not the criminals or get caught or even get surveilled like younger people do. So all of those things go into it, but that would be a maturation effect, okay? It's not that they become any less criminalistic. It's that crime is a young person's sport, okay? Maybe grandpa really is still a criminal, but he just doesn't have the energy to do the things that he did before. So that's a very simplified way of looking at maturation. So when you do your research, you have to use some sort of instrument. And by instrument, it can mean anything, but a way to get data, okay? And the most popular instrument would be a questionnaire, okay? It's easy, it's going to work, right? So we call questionnaires and things like that an instrument. What all it means is it's a tool by which you're going to get data. And there's all kinds of instruments out there, not just questionnaires, but questionnaires are popular. Okay, so you will have to have an instrument. If you are going to do questionnaires, it's always easiest if you have one that's already published. So if you're going to do a study on death penalty and you want to know what people think about the death penalty, hey, there's a lot of studies that were done called Attitudes Toward Death Penalty, and you can use their questionnaire, and you don't even have to go back and make a new questionnaire. You can modify it by adding some particular questions that you're interested in, but they already exist, and it's an easy peasy way of doing research, okay? So just remember that anything that gets you data that you're going to use to collect data, that's called an instrument. Okay, I'm going to leave off there for now and answer the forum questions so I can get your financial aid and, scholarship stuff in order. And I'll see you on Tuesday. It's a great day to be a dragon.